It is my joy and pleasure to introduce Rhonda Papp from AISO. So take it away, Rhonda.
Thank you, Dr. Alley. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to read the land acknowledgement that we have at the university to start us off on the right foot. So I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I want to pay respects to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. So AISO and I, the American Indian Student Organization, got together and we would really like to share some of our thoughts, just like initial thoughts about land acknowledgement and why it's important to us. So I'll start it off. I would say that a land acknowledgement, especially at the University of San Diego, is very important to me because we're toreros for a reason. We're change makers. We want to, look at the world in a different way and kind of learn with, what we're given and, and be educated citizens. And I think that it really fits in very perfectly. So that you're going to a university on a land that was taken. And so I think by recognizing that and having, just kind of thinking about it, really, makes you a better citizen and a better change maker on campus. With that, I'll pass it on to Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Luker. I'm the vice chair of AISO. I'm also from the Pechanga Band of Luiseño Indians. And for me, the land acknowledgement is like acknowledging my existence as a student at USD. And that's, since there's so few of us, that's something that isn't very common at most schools. And so I personally really like that USD has it, and I think it's a good first step in expanding Indigenous representation on campus. And with that, I'll pass it off to Micah.
Hi, my name is Micah Zephyr. I'm from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. I'm Lakota Dakota from North Dakota. Land acknowledgement is very important to me as it's engraved into my roots. I grew up on my reservation my entire life. Everywhere I go, I like to know what traditional territories, because those belong to the first people that they called home. So I think it's very important to honor those communities, honor those territories, because that's where they share their story. That's where those people, it has a lot of history, it has a lot of value, it shows signs of respect, it recognizes them. And one of our main values as Indigenous people is respect. And that's part of that give and take that we show to the land. And I think that's very important, that not only at USD do we implement that, but anywhere you go, because land acknowledgement should be acknowledged everywhere. And with that, I will pass that to Nina.
Nina actually told me tentatively that she could not make it anymore.
Oh,
so.
Unless Nina's not here, I'll pass it to Dominique.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dominique. I'm an ally and I'm the communications officer. Personally, I think it's imperative to practice land acknowledgements because it's a way to honor Indigenous land and their peoples of the past, present, and future. It pays tribute and honor to the land and works in reconciliation for the transgenerational injustices that America has committed over the years. I think it is also grounding and helps us be mindful and present at this university. And with that, I'll pass it off to Bryn.
Thank you, Dominique. And my name is Bryn. I'm also an ally of AISO on campus. And I think the land acknowledgement is so important for a number of reasons, but mainly to decolonize our campus. We do have, as a Catholic university that's based on the kind of mission style, we do have that history of coloniality. And so I think to recognize that this land was originally belonging to someone else is so imperative. And currently, it definitely relates to the crisis that's happening at the border to take away more of Kumeyaay land. So for us to recognize as students, as the new generation, that this land was theirs, we can create change going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. With that, I would like to pass it on over to Angel to introduce our lovely speakers today.
Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angel Henzo. I'm an assistant professor in ethnic studies. I am a citizen of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. So we have Theresa Rocha Beardall. She is assistant professor of sociology, criminology, and American Indian studies at Virginia Tech University. Her scholarship examines how systems of law and agents of the state enact and enforce various modes of state violence, specializing in issues of race, class, federal policy, and tribal sovereignty. And we also have Theresa Stewart-Ambo. Theresa is an assistant professor of education studies at the University of California, San Diego. Her research focuses on the role of higher education on Native nation building, specifically examining the historical and contemporary relationships between public universities and Native nations in California. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Angel. And sorry, I think when I popped up my share screen, I probably popped you off of your screen. Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here today. And thank you to everybody who invited Theresa and I to give this presentation. I'm gonna turn it over. I can't see her on the screen anymore. So I'm gonna turn it over to Theresa to get us started.
Thank you, everyone. It's so great to be with you, even if it's virtually. I'm in Virginia, but I was born and raised in San Diego. So it's nice to kind of be with you all virtually. It's nighttime here. Hopefully you have a beautiful sunset right now. So this is the tricky part. We have one Google slideshow, so we're not going to be able to kind of communicate back and forth. We've tried this. We're not maybe the most savvy at this. So we will just kind of hand off where we know our cues are. So Theresa, you're rocking it already. All right, so to get started, thank you so much for having us, USD. And to begin, I'd just like to explain a little bit about what's going to happen throughout this talk. So let me just start by saying that formal land acknowledgements are a growing, evolving social justice practice designed to recognize local Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of our homelands. But despite this uptake, land acknowledgements remain understudied. And what I mean by understudies is not like you and I, but in the academic literature. In addition to being understudied, land acknowledgements are often misunderstood in regard to the purpose of these statements, the tone, the responsibility, the importance of educational equity, and the implications for measurable support of local Indigenous communities that are named within the statements, if communities are named at all. So in this presentation, we're going to introduce you to our investigation into the current use of land acknowledgements at U.S. land grant institutions. What we're thinking about is how these statements are constructed, how they're deployed at various universities. And then after contextualizing kind of the foundational questions and topics that kind of undergird our research, we're going to discuss a lot of the tensions, a lot of the things that make land acknowledgements really complicated and that really kind of separate how we understand and how we welcome each other as Indigenous peoples versus how settlers may give a land acknowledgement.
Okay, so again, thank you everybody. And I want to acknowledge everything that the students mentioned with regard to land acknowledgement. I feel like, you know, we had the privilege of learning from them. And I think what we're going to be doing today is really echoing what they're saying with regard to this practice and protocol around acknowledgement. And so as we begin our presentation, we want to acknowledge the skies, the waters, the land, and the human and non-human beings that sustain and nourish our thinking where we live and work in Virginia and in San Diego. Land acknowledgement as a practice is gaining popularity in higher education institutions. And while we are committed to this practice as Indigenous women, we're also critical of how, when, and where acknowledgements are deployed. We are weary of the uncritical adoption and caution that the performance of land acknowledgements can become a rote gesture. Our project and presentation today invites you all into this critique, and we will have a little bit of an interactive activity that kind of brings you all in. And we seek with our project and this presentation to understand the use of land acknowledgements so that we're able to provide guidance to others, particularly non-Indigenous people, and move us beyond this simple recitation of a statement to action. Living and working in the territory of the Kumeyaay and the Tutelo Monacan nations, we ask ourselves, how do we move beyond land acknowledgement? What do land acknowledgements compel us to do? How can we live in better relationship with the land and the people of the places we live and work? And we want to make note of the particular time, the particular period of time that we're in our nation. There's been a lot of political uprising. We're in a global pandemic, approaching a twindemic if that hasn't already started. And I think we all are called on asking ourselves, like, how can land acknowledgements compel us to do more? And so for us, it really compels us to support the solidarity between Black and Indigenous communities. Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are not mutually exclusive movements or desires. And in fact, they are interconnected through settler colonialism. So to move beyond land acknowledgements and put into action what we're learning here today, we encourage you to look up and to support the Black Lives Matter group in San Diego, Kumeyaay Community College, and the Kumeyaay Defense Against the Wall, which are all community-based activist initiatives addressing current political issues in the San Diego County area.
When I'm not teaching, I have to remind myself, turn on your microphone, Theresa. So I just want to, before we kind of press forward, I want to mark this day as Indigenous Peoples Day. And as Native women who are actively celebrating our Indigenous families, students, and relations, we want to make sure that we extend you all a happy Indigenous Peoples Day. This day is tremendously important, as you all know and as we know. It's a tremendously important milestone in our nation's recognition of the presence and power of our First Peoples who have lived and cared for our lands since time immemorial. And as we know, this fight for this day was not an easy or fast process. And so some of the, I think it was, well, Theresa forwarded it to me, but I think it came from Persephone, kind of laid out some of this really important timeline, historical timeline. And so we know that we begin with October 12th, 1792, when the first recorded celebration of Columbus Day took place. And it was 100 years later, in 1892, when President Benjamin Harrison issued a proclamation urging the US to mark this day, advocating for loyalty to the nation's progress and its patriotism. Many, however, point to the beginnings of Columbus Day in particular in 1934, when President FDR declared the national observance of this day at the request of the Knights of Columbus and New York's Italian-American community. And it was in 1937, on October 12th, that it became a national holiday. Beginning in 1977, though, things were shifting formally at the international level when the UN International Conference on Discrimination Against Indigenous Peoples in the Americas proposed that Indigenous Peoples Day replace Columbus Day. And for us, this particular moment in time, 43 years ago, is really important. It marks the evolution of this day into Indigenous Peoples Day. So for us, this means that 2020 is critically important, as this year marks the tipping point toward the collective recognition of Indigenous peoples in the US and around the world. So from here on out in our calendars, we're making the strong argument that we have more years moving forward on our calendars that register years of celebrating Indigenous peoples than years of celebrating Indigenous genocide and those who commit genocide. So what are we going to do today? We're going to go over kind of these three main areas. This is our general outline. We're going to start by talking about what land-grant universities are. We don't want to assume that we're all on the same page, so we're going to do a lot of this legwork to make sure we get on the same page. So when you all are in your awesome breakout rooms, you feel a sense of confidence about how to talk about critically land acknowledgement statements and their relationships to land grants broadly. We are each at land grants, Theresa and myself. We want to think about the effects of land grant universities on our Indigenous communities. Then we want to shift into talking about land acknowledgement statements and really define what are they. We want to have an interactive conversation about these statements. We're going to give you a few examples and we want you to talk with us in the chat about what you see and what you don't see. And then we'll wrap up with a few implications and where we hope we all go from here.
I'll have to unmute myself too. I have the same problem, Theresa. With this outline in mind, let's dig into some of the basic elements of our current collaborative project, which again is the title of this talk, Performance or Progress Evaluating Settler Land Acknowledgements at Public Land Grant Universities. Our research is a discourse analysis of land acknowledgement statements at 1862 land grant colleges and universities. And this work takes into account the geographic location, institutional characteristics, as well as an examination of the language, intention, and tone of these statements. We also analyze where, when, and how the statements are deployed. We find this research to be important for a number of reasons. Settler colonialism is an ongoing process that continues to dispossess Native people of their land, resources, and lifestyles. We focus specifically on land grant institutions because they've played and they continue to play a role in Indigenous dispossession. And additionally, we are interested in whether there are any stakes in these land acknowledgements because performances of allyship are not enough, meaning land acknowledgements, if they're meant to do anything at all, must move beyond being a performative gesture and instead make concrete commitments to and for Native people, students, faculty, and staff. So to provide a little bit of context for the group, and we will connect this to USD as a private institution, but we thought we'd lay the foundation for this study in particular first. We wanted to provide some context by first focusing on the definition of a land grant university, which we will provide more detail focus as we keep moving on. So in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for new colleges and universities across the nation. In the same year, he also signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, which also, we'll say, gave away Native lands to homesteaders and allowed for the construction of the Pacific Railroad, which is a real lay of explanation of these three policies that happened in 1862. All of the land grants would have not been possible without the violence endured by Indigenous people and the communities that led to their physical removal from their lands. During this time, the US government was low in funds. It was approaching the Civil War, and so the Indigenous lands that were used to underwrite these acts came from stolen Indigenous land. The 1862 Morrill Act distributed public domain land over the states to develop universities. And these lands were expropriated from tribal nations. They became seed money for higher education institutions. Specifically, 30,000 acres were granted to states per congressional member. And so in California, 150,000 acres were given. And in Virginia, where the other Theresa is, 300,000 acres were given.
Okay, so with this important history in mind, I want us to turn to this map here to consider where and really when these land grant universities were created. So beginning first with the red dots that say 1862, there are 56 of these schools in total. These are the schools that were established under the original Morrill Act of 1862. We'll move on to these stars, white stars. There are 19 of these in total. These stars show schools that were established under the 1890 reiteration of the Morrill Act, which was specifically for colleges and universities for African American students. Then we'll move to the blue squares, which account for 29 additional land grants. Super interesting history here. We won't really get into these two, but we'd love to talk about it. These 29 blue squares show the schools that were established under the 1994 reiteration of the Morrill Act for tribal colleges and universities. And so how did all of this work? How did we get these dots and squares and stars? Essentially, states in the East who did not have land to acquire in their own home state were given what's called scrip to exchange for land in the West. Most Eastern states sold their scrip to land speculators. And just so we're all on the same page, to clarify, land scrip is essentially a voucher that entitles the holder of that scrip to a discrete amount of public lands. And we'll keep kind of air quoting public lands or open lands because as we'll get into, these are indigenous lands. States in the West, however, they were able to obtain land within their own state to sell. So this is important as we think about implications for universities to various indigenous moments and communities of dispossession. So in 2020, I feel like our eyes were open to a whole lot of things this year, if they weren't open before, but specifically in 2020, many of our eyes were open to the historical and financial reality that land-grant universities may actually be better termed land grab universities. And so if you haven't already seen this expose in High Country News, we encourage you to turn to the work of journalists Tristan Antone and historian Robert Lee. And we're sure you probably have already seen this. If not, we'll send out the link. Anton and Lee's research is significant for a variety of reasons, and I just kind of want to go over a few points. The first reason is that this report identified 10.7 million acres of indigenous lands across 24 states. That's 80,000 land parcels. What this means is that they were able to trace back and locate with geographic confidence over 99% of the acreage that was used to fund the Morrill Act. Another key point in this research, and this, there's a database that goes along with it, which is really exciting, is that this report was able to monetize this indigenous dispossession. So in addition to locating with confidence geographically where these lands are that were given away using Morrill Act scrip, they were actually able to monetize that dispossession, showing that less than $400,000 was paid at that time, paid for native lands, which in turn raised upwards of $18 million for university endowments. And additionally, this report identified those lands and universities that were granted mineral rights. And in many cases, these lands continue to generate revenue, mineral right revenues for land grab universities. And the last point I want to bring up, if I can get my screen to move, is this final point about trust land. I wanted to make sure I could see the exact number, so I said it correctly. This report identifies 500,000 acres that remain in trust to universities. And so we want to be able to talk about this hopefully towards the end, because in our opinion, these 500 acres that remain in trust to universities are ripe for return and rematriation to indigenous peoples, which is something that we hope you will consider as you think kind of more broadly about the history and legacy of not just land grants, but kind of institutions of higher education. And so this research is significant for a whole bunch of reasons, but specifically because it provides us kind of with a through line of historical events that connects our institutions to indigenous dispossession. And it makes apparent how universities at one point profited and then continue to profit from these kind of original historical moments in the mid-1800s. So I want to kind of flip back to this map. So the previous map that we showed you is kind of the standard map of you know, where are land grants in the country? And then you have the dots and the squares and the stars. And what we want to draw your attention to here is that there's a series of maps that Tristan and Robert made that show us something really different. And so this map is developed by High Country News, and it depicts the spread of land scripts across the US. And so you're going to note that much of the scripts were located in California, meaning that those vouchers, those kind of promissory notes for land were cashed in the West. So in addition to California, we also see a lot of land script was kind of put into what is now the state of Minnesota, Michigan, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And you're also going to note from this map towards the right side of the screen that there were really no scripts located in the East, where lands were already being populated by settler communities. And so with this kind of a strong grasp of kind of what are land grant universities, what are their effects in our communities in terms of dispossession and the financialization of our dispossession that then create endowments for countless universities in the US. We want to take that knowledge, we want to transition into thinking about kind of what is a land acknowledgement, why do we need them, and what do they do? And then, like I promised in the beginning, we'll show you a couple and then we'll talk them through together.
Thank you, Theresa. So to contextualize the examination of land acknowledgements at land-grant universities, we offer a little bit of grounding in the literature and the practice related to these statements. And the first thing that I want to begin by acknowledging is that these statements and these practices are not new. Indigenous people across the globe have sustained practices and protocols for recognizing, acknowledging, announcing, welcoming, and inviting each other, as well as non-Indigenous people into their territory since time immemorial. These protocols reflect a deep relationship with the land, as well as a relationship with other Native nations, and then, following contact, a relationship to settlers. And these protocols, they're guided by the ways that Indigenous people know to and desire to present themselves during political, ceremonial, and even now social gatherings. You might have witnessed an Indigenous person conducting a welcome or an acknowledgement of some sort on your campus at USD. I know this happens quite often, or at public events. And something I want to point out is that these aren't acknowledgement statements. These are welcomings. These are the Kumeyaay people welcoming you into their home territory. Not too long ago, we had a garden unveiled on the UC San Diego campus, and Mike Connolly was there. And he made mention, we want you to acknowledge us because we want to do what we do in practicing our culture and welcome you into our territory. And so that was a really profound moment for me because it really demonstrated like our understandings and our practices of land acknowledgement statements are very different than what we do in academia at a conference with each other. And so that's a place that I'd like to start. What I like to call these statements are land-based, tribal, intertribal, trans-Indigenous diplomatic protocols of recognition. So what are the land acknowledgements, or what I like to call settler land acknowledgements? Settler land acknowledgements are more commonplace in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. In these countries, acknowledgements have been more or less initiated in the public arena in response to truth and reconciliation efforts, national apologies, and national policies. These practices have a variety of names as well: Indigenous acknowledgements, territorial acknowledgements, land acknowledgements, welcome to country, welcome of country, and acknowledgement of country, to name a few. These practices are now being imported into the US, and they're actually gaining a lot of popularity in social activists, social justice, equity-minded spaces, some of which of those spaces include higher education settings. And so you're likely to hear a formal settler acknowledgement be defined as a formal statement designed to recognize local Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of their homelands. And you may have heard, again, a land acknowledgement recited at the opening of a campus event. You might have read it on a campus website. There are many reasons, and the AISO students pointed out really beautifully why people practice land acknowledgements. And so we wanted to also make this point in our presentation. There are many reasons why land acknowledgements are practiced, and these reasons actually are not without any sort of issue or concern. For some, land acknowledgements are performed to show respect, to express gratitude and appreciation, to pay tribute, or to honor. Other reasons are to recognize the enduring relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories, and to make visible that relationship or that community that's often erased by the settler colonial narrative. It's also to recognize forgotten and suppressed histories. In higher education institutions, as we're seeing with this, this actual presentation and workshop that's being put on by all the Native organizations at USD, students, faculty, and staff often engage this practice as an anti-colonial or a decolonial mechanism, using the practice to disrupt the colonial environment, to educate and advocate with the hope of transforming their institution. When spoken in settings where land acknowledgements aren't typically practiced, these statements serve as a critical intervention. It can be an entry point into learning and opening of a conversation about how to make deeper commitments to Indigenous communities. And so now, this is not to say that there aren't tensions in these practices and intentions. A lot of my thinking, and hopefully yours and everyone's thinking, is really guided by Indigenous scholar activists. And again, as we mentioned, there's not a lot of literature on this, on examination of statements or statements in the US. And so these scholar activists caution us that statements can become performative, and therefore they can become empty gestures. Many of us have witnessed the uncritical recitation of statements, the careless insertion of statements into public events or presentations or classes, or we've also witnessed the painfully awkward mispronunciation of tribal names and places. We may even be guilty of it ourselves. And that's a tension we have to reconcile within ourselves. I know I'm not innocent of this, and I'm still learning, and I think we all are learning about land acknowledgement as a process and a practice and how to do better. You might have noted in your observations too how language in the statements place Indigenous people in the past, or it can place Indigenous people in the past, which infers that they no longer live with us or among us. And sometimes the language in the statements thank Indigenous people for their land, which infers or assumes that the lands were willingly given. There's also the use of language that reinforces tropes or stereotypes that romanticize Indigenous people as these ecological figures. Land acknowledgements, to be quite honest, are filled with contradictions as well. I experienced this with my own university's statement. It's not official, but it's our statement that we're all collectively using. The statement, sometimes statements can indicate a respect for Indigenous people without material evidence that such respect actually exists on behalf of the institution. And so now I'll turn to Theresa for our exercise.
So we've given you a lot of background and history and kind of foundational elements to how we came to then begin to analyze the actual statements issued by land-grant universities. So again, what we were trying to do is to kind of get us all on the same page so that we could provide you with 2 examples of statements. And what we want you to do is just to take a minute to read each one. And what we want you to look for really is what is being named, what is not being named in these statements, what kind of ideas about indigeneity and Indigenous peoples are being evoked or not. And then we want you to tell us in the chat Statement 1 is telling me this, or statement 2 is telling me this. So we'll just kind of be quiet for 2 to 3 minutes while you read these, and we want you to share back again what you're seeing and what you're not seeing in these statements. And you can do that in the chat. And I'll know you're ready when I start to see all of your comments come into the chat. So again, just type them directly in there for me.
If you know Stan Rodriguez, I'll use his infamous expression, I believe in you.
Okay, I always know that I'm ready to start when I can scroll them, when there's enough to scroll through. So I can scroll now. So you guys are awesome. Thank you for doing this, and keep them coming, especially as I start to read some of the comments from the chat back right now, and it jogs your memory or you think of something, please write it in the chat. So let me see if I can scroll up now. Now there's a lot. You guys are great. All right, so the first one says, and I'm going to use names, and I apologize if I don't say them correctly. Please just correct me. Kalia says in statement 1, it lacks recognition of harm. It also reads kind of condescending in regards to kind of this idea of strength and resilience. Then there's another message that the name came to me privately, so I won't say that name. And it says that in statement 1, there's a lot of romanticism going on, maybe a lot of lip service, whereas statement 2 has no specific nations mentioned, which is really important. Evan says, I feel like statement 2 is more genuine. And Kayla says statement 1 names each specific tribe. It seems to fall into this kind of noble native trope though. Steffi says, well, the first one seems to thank them for the land that was stolen from them. I really like that real short and to the point comment. That's great. Angel says statement 1 names the communities. Again, statement 2 does not directly acknowledge the tribes or indigenous peoples by name. I'm glad that you all are picking up on that. But statement 2 does feel more genuine to some people. And the second one Cassie says, the second one seems to better acknowledge that what happened was wrong and seems more prepared to take further steps. So there's this kind of actionable future going on. And Wendy says in statement 2, I see terms like acknowledge and respect, whereas in statement 1, I see the terms thank you, which could imply permission was granted, but we don't have evidence of that. And I'll just scroll all the way down because now there's a ton. And I'll pick up on the last few. Alyssa says, though statement 2 does not mention peoples by name, it is at least acknowledging past and present struggles, as well as their continual presence in the space, which is really important, continued presence. Bryn says, however, statement 2 acts like the person speaking has a connection to the spiritual ancestors, which may be an intrusion of the native people. Some people think about that as romanticization. Sarah says, statement 2 recognizes the importance of the land acknowledgement in itself. And Dominique says in statement 1, specific communities are named, but seems kind of performative. And TJ says in statement 2, however, it seems like it's directly speaking to and from settlers without mentioning any specific Indigenous folk. And for folks who are on the call, Dr. Talley and I went to grad school together. So I love being able to kind of be with him here tonight and then see his name in the chat. So let me just ask Theresa to flip us to, great, the next slide. So this kind of reveals that we don't mean to, you know, place shame or blame on any particular university, which is why we don't show you the names of the universities first. We show you now just so you have a sense of connecting lands and peoples named with universities. So we're not going to make a value judgment on who's doing it right or wrong. But what we do want to point out is a number of things that you all have already done really well. So in the first statement, we see that actual peoples are named. And in the second, we don't. We also kind of see these ideas about forgiveness and action. And we also see, and that's in statement 2, and in statement 1, we see this phrase, uphold our responsibilities. So there's this notation that there are things that need to be done as a result of being on the territory of these people, because they don't just say we gather on what was once the territory of the Mohegan and others. They say the land on which we gather is the territory of the Mohegan and others. And so we want us to just kind of pay attention to these phrasings. And then we're going to transition into UCLA, and Theresa's going to talk about that.
Before I talk about UCLA, I want to say something about the authors of acknowledgements. So the intention of us doing this interrogation into these statements is not to critique those people who are authoring these statements, because often they're Native faculty, staff, and or students at those institutions. And so that's not the intent. Our intent is really to look at the languages that is being used in these statements to provide recommendations or guidance for those nearly 3,000 other institutions in the US that could potentially be picking up this practice. And so the other thing to say is there really is no right or wrong way to do this. Oftentimes acknowledgements, if done correctly, and this is the case of UCLA, are done in collaboration with the community. And so there might be language and tensions existing within that acknowledgement that may be unsettling. But if it's done with the desires of the community embedded in it, then that's how the community has asked to be acknowledged, or that people acknowledge them. And so again, there's no right way of doing this. Theresa and I both went to UCLA, and that's actually where we met and did our degrees in American Indian Studies. And you know, we've since graduated, but we both are still at land-grant institutions, and we both love UCLA for all the great experiences we had there and how it brought us together and has kept us connected. And in 2017, UCLA developed a land acknowledgement statement in collaboration with the Tongva community, in particular, elders and cultural educators. And I was really privileged to be a part of this process. And again, you know, it's not a perfect process, but the statement that you see here on this slide reflects the desires of the community. And one of those being that the Tongva language is used in the statement. So the land acknowledgement, and I should point out that this is a land acknowledgement put out by the American Indian Studies program and American Indian Studies Center, not the university. And so it reads, the American Indian Studies program and American Indian Studies Center at UCLA acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of Tovangar and are grateful for the opportunity to work for the Tarahum in this place. As a land-grant institution, we pay respect to the Hunukpatum, the Ihihiram, and the Iuhinikam, the past, present, and emerging. And so while the statement represents a respect for the wishes of the community and the elders, we also want to say that we are still critical of it in the way it reflects the land grant history of UCLA. And so that kind of connects us back to this land grant history that we foregrounded this conversation in. And we want to close today, we'll go over implications, but one thing we want to talk about is connecting land acknowledgement and our work at land grant institutions to University of San Diego, USD, right? So the land acknowledgement, what land acknowledgement does not take into account at UCLA is how particularly complicated the history of the state is. And the fact that our state, California, has benefited from 3 waves of colonization. These waves, along with federal policy, made way for an exorbitant amount of scripts allotted in the state, all of which have clear implications for the University of San Diego. And so something I just wanted to point out, I've done a little bit of historical research on how UCLA as an institution received its land. And with some assistance from Persephone, I was able to kind of map on here to this timeline, or to the timeline and the historical events of California, what happened in San Diego. And I would really encourage you all to take a deeper dive into this. I'd be happy to join and partner in any sort of way. But I'll point out that in 1769, the San Diego mission was built in the Spanish or mission period. Shortly thereafter, during Mexican governance or the Rancho period, this pueblo, and you see it over here in the Mission Bay area, was developed or created. And so the rancho was called Rancho Pueblo Lands of San Diego. Mexico recognized San Diego as a pueblo at this time and allowed for municipal government to form. The land was called, in lay terms, Pueblo Lands, and attached to it was a city charter for public use to pasture farm animals and for recreation. Shortly thereafter, we had the California Gold Rush that kind of overlapped a bit with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this is when we enter the US period and we start to see lands be privatized. So these ranchos that were originally distributed to Mexican citizens are now, the US government has to decide what they're gonna do with it. And something that's particularly unique to California at this time, and it happened in other places in the US, but was the 1850 Act for the government and protection of Indians, which allowed for indentured servitude. And then following that was the signing of treaties, I'm thinking I'm numbering them wrong, but treaties in California that were never ratified with 118 tribes. And then in the 60s, the US government and state government financed the murder of California Indians in the state through the act entitled Act for the Payment of Expenses Incurred in the Suspension of Indian Hostiles in the State of California. And this effectively funded 9 militia campaigns to kill California Indians between the late 40s to the late 50s. San Diego, moving from a pueblo into a private territory or moving into the city, it, from what I found, went under this legal battle or was under legal contention for almost 30 years. And it wasn't until 1872 or so that a lot of the legal actions were I'm trying to think of the right word, when San Diego actually became an institution. And so the evidence that Percy helped me find was, many years later, we're approaching like 30 years later, the Sisters of Mercy deeded 62 acres were deeded 62 acres from the St. Joseph's Hospital. And then in 1944, the diocese purchased the original 62 acres from the sisters. And all this land was originally a part of that Pueblo lands plot. And of course, there's more research to go into with it when it comes to this. But we did want to connect, this history that was experienced during the land grant period. It's much more complicated and it's much more deeply rooted when we start to look at the colonial layers of California and how the government and private citizens strategically and very intentionally sought to remove California Indians from their territory so that institutions, public and private, including USD, could exist today.
Okay, so I'm going to take over. Thank you, Theresa, and kind of wrap us up. So we're going to just kind of spend 1 minute to go over some implications and next steps before we kind of move ourselves into our breakout room. So, wait for that slide. Thank you, Theresa, and thank you for being such a good sport about knowing when I'm pausing to move the slides. It's been really kind of you to do that. So some of the implications of this research and really why we're doing this kind of bigger, broader empirical analysis of what all of the statements say is that a number of implications have emerged from these analysis. And the first is that there is a real concerted need and call for universities to acknowledge and atone for their participation and complacency, not just in contemporary kind of historical moments, but also in their relationship to Indigenous dispossession, both in the 1800s and as it continues today. And there's a real need for acknowledgement about how universities are beneficiaries of Indigenous dispossession. And so something we call the moral responsibilities. And so it's not just that, we got a little bit of money, we were able to create an endowment and we, moved the heck on. This dispossession financially benefited the institution and its endowment. And we all as land grants, we continue to draw on that endowment, which was created from the dispossession and financialization of Indigenous peoples and homelands. Another implication of this work is that it necessitates an acknowledgement of both land and people. So if we are going to acknowledge, which we hope that we do, kind of how we got here, what we're doing here, and where we're moving forward, in terms of relationships with Indigenous peoples, we really need to be naming both the lands and the peoples in our statements. Another implication is that this work asks us to move beyond the performative statement towards a tribal university partnership and real clear investment in Native nation building and tribal sovereignty. And this doesn't mean that as land grant universities, we get to decide what that means for Native peoples. This means that we have to do the real hard work, the decades-long work of building solid relationships with our tribal communities both near us and for us as a land grant in the East, for those Native peoples that our land script affected and dispossessed in the West. So there's a much larger conversation about kind of who needs to be in conversation together that this necessitates. This also requires us to rethink institutional accountability and resources. And so there are a lot of ways we argue that you can use the resources that you have at your disposal at your university, whether you're a land grant or not, and to really reimagine what those resources are for and how they can be used to benefit tribal communities, Native students, the creation of kind of spaces for Native students to gather, to be able to study and kind of be in community and solidarity together. There are a lot of things we need to do to kind of rethink those resources. And kind of last but not least, and arguably my favorite, is that this research really requires us to reconsider not just those 500,000 acres of land that remain in trust, but really all of the lands associated with our universities, and to think about what is our responsibility and the necessity of rematriating these lands back to Indigenous peoples. And this kind of takes our work and aligns it with a larger social activist movement of #LandBack, And, you know, we can answer this in the Q&A, but in the event, people often say, well, what if we can't give the land back? Then we say, well, what can you pay a land tax? So there are lots of other things we can do creatively to think about what our relationship and responsibilities are in terms of making sure lands and resources go back to Native peoples. And that's where we will wrap up. Persephone, you tell us what you need, and we are here to help make it happen.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So everybody, let's give thank yous in the chat box. Let's put up our little hands. Thank you so much to Dr. Beardall and Dr. Ambo for spending this time with us and really educating us around land acknowledgement statements, what it's looking like across the nation, and the continued responsibility of institutions to Indigenous people, but then also our responsibilities also as settlers within the lands as well. So thank you so much. And now we're going to transition into our breakout rooms. So Cassie is going to break you all up.
Bella, you need studies here at USD, and I've been tasked with the awesome responsibility of facilitating our large group discussion. And so I just want to say a big thank you for our speakers today. You two are doing such important, amazing work, and we all just learned so much from listening to you speak. I also really want to take a moment to just thank the AISO students for the collective wisdom. They really wanted this to be an interactive Zoom session and do small group and large group, and as a way for us to not just receive this knowledge, but to begin to engage with it. And I know for myself, as a white settler Canadian scholar who's very new to San Diego area, I appreciate these opportunities so much to be in dialogue and to think through ways of engaging meaningfully with these land acknowledgement statements, and as our speakers so eloquently put it, operationalizing them and moving beyond them. So with all that being said, I'm going to open it up to discussion. So now's a chance for questions, for comments, for teachings, for thoughts. And so you can use the raise your hand feature in the Zoom, or otherwise you can send some questions via the chat and we can negotiate it that way as well. So don't be shy.
I think because I'm a facilitator, I'm not allowed to raise my hand, I guess, but I wanted to point out something that came up in our discussion. Tejas pointed out that San Diego has the most tribes out of any city in the US, and in part because we're just a huge city, but because of that, it should be easy for the University of San Diego to decolonize, right? But we also, we mentioned like a way to do that is to hire more Indigenous staff and Native tribal liaisons. So that's something that came up.
So perhaps that's something we can include in some of our land acknowledgement statements as encouragement to the university. I see there's a hand up by Anna Patricia.
Yeah, just in our group, we just kind of discussed about how not all professors have the land acknowledgement statements on their syllabi. And like, even if they did, maybe they won't read it at the beginning of class. So I think that was important for like, cause we were talking about how many classes you have that have that on their syllabi. And I take Spanish classes and stuff like that. And like, but then like, it was my last business class I'm taking right now. She read it at the beginning of class before she even went into the logistics of class, and just kind of before she went into the scheduling and like how many exams we have. Cause I feel like students just rush to that bottom of the page and see like how many midterms, like how much part of this is worth my grade and stuff like that. So I think it really stuck out that she read it. That was the first thing that she read.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. I think you're calling attention to what our speakers have been noting, which is the danger of these land acknowledgements becoming empty performative gestures. I see Brooke Powell has her hand raised.
Yeah, so I was actually in the same group, so just kind of go off of what she was saying. I definitely think there are some professors that are better at acknowledging it than others. And one like thing that a lot of my professors have been doing is talking about not only where you are in San Diego, but because we're so dispersed throughout the country, just reflecting on where you are as a whole and like thinking about it wherever you go, and thinking about whose land you are, even if you're traveling, whose land you're on, even if you're traveling, when you're in San Diego, when you're at home. And I think that's a really important acknowledgement that's adapting to our current situation.
Thank you so much for that comments. Maybe one of our speakers want to offer some teachings or guidance or advice on how best to engage with and operationalize these land acknowledgement statements in this new e-learning context.
Something that I always tell people when they are thinking about, how do I practice land acknowledgement? I always say first, why are you doing this? Ask yourself, why are you engaging this practice? So that you approach it from a genuine way. And then, teaching from an online context, what I have seen people do is acknowledging not only, the group or the university, the people where they're presenting to, like say if it's for USD, acknowledging the Kumeyaay, but they acknowledge where they're presenting from. And so it's saying like, I'm zooming from North San Diego County, which is shared territory between the Luiseño and the Kumeyaay, right? Or those in LA that are on Tongva territory, or Theresa who's zooming from Virginia. I know that's a practice people are adopting. And I think that the last thing I'll say, and then Theresa, you could add if you would like, or we could have another question, is there's a lot of ways to do land acknowledgement. I don't think that there's any correct way. There are better ways of doing it over others, of course. And so if you were to just do a simple Google search, you could be able to identify the traditional, ancestral, current homelands of tribal nations. You have to do the work. And put that time in before asking an Indigenous person to do that labor or to give you an answer. I think that if you approach it with the right reason as to why, and then you do your work and you're coming with it with a good intention, that is a first step. But of course, we also are asking ourselves, like, what is, in knowing this history and knowing the people, whose place this is, what does this knowledge compel me to do, right? And so it can't just be a gesture. And sometimes you have to start with that, but I think that the next question you need to ask yourself is, what does this compel me to do? How can I make this knowledge, how can I transform it into action? So that's all I'll say.
And I'll add, and this is, take this for what you will, because I'm a more intense person, I think. I'm the more intense Theresa of the two of us. I really encourage, whether it's an e-learning venue or the moment when we can be back face to face, for us to rethink the work that we expect the land acknowledgement to do. And so in addition to having land acknowledgement statements and presenting them and engaging with them, think about how the rest of your department is engaging with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous knowledge production. Think about and think critically about how syllabi for the classes either that you teach or that you're taking reflect indigeneity, reflect community, reflect a sense of responsibility to Indigenous peoples and issues and needs. And then, I tell all my students who take a variety of courses that I teach on race and policing and sociology of law, when you're here, you're going to learn a little bit of federal Indian law, and you're going to learn a little bit of Indigenous studies because you need to, because of the history of what is now the United States. There's no way around it. There's no way I can teach you something about, contemporary policing in America without also asking you to be responsible for the history that created the nation and then creates the historical and social context that we find ourselves in. So I would say, think about the work you want that statement to do, and then make sure every other part of your kind of academic enterprise and your academic moment is also fulfilling the work you expect the acknowledgement statement to do, because that statement alone can't do all that work.
Thank you both so very much for those responses. I see Jackie Crane.
More intense than I.
I see Jackie Crane has her hand raised, so would you please go ahead?
Hi, my name's Jackie. I'm a senior at USD, and I guess my question is for all of the faculty here. I was talking with my group members about how in my almost 4 years at USD, I've only seen maybe like 3 land acknowledgements across all my syllabi. And we were also discussing how it's generally within courses in like sometimes theology, ethnic studies. So it's kind of like specific to like different departments or in some classes, which kind of it's like framed around. And I was wondering if there's any encouragement or like what the encouragement looks like, or if it's more of like a, you should do this, or like kind of what you were talking about, Dr. Ambo, with like how, like, what are you actually going to do about it? Like, are you doing it just to be performative, or do you actually mean something about it? Like, are there any discussions about that, or?
Dr. Medina, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, hi Jackie, thank you for your question. I'm one of those professors that includes the statement, and I usually try to read it in person, you know, definitely the first day of class at the beginning. And I teach classes in Spanish and Latin American cultural history. And so what I try to do throughout the semester is to keep in mind at the foreground also, you know, the reality of Indigenous peoples in the places that I talk about in class. And so, you know, to keep that into account, you know, that the history even of Spanish itself, right, it's also a colonial history within California, which some people seem to forget. And some people also seem to forget that having mixed background gives you, because there's different politics, right? And so, you know, people think that because you come from Latin America and because you may be mixed, and in the States all of a sudden you can claim indigeneity, when in reality, if you're coming from a Latin American country, you cannot do that, because especially if you come from family that benefits from, you know, the colonial settlement economies, whether it be coffee, cattle, or whatever. So, you know, so then I try to position myself so to perhaps help students also who may be in a similar situation also, you know, deal with that uncomfortable reality of coming from, you know, being a settler, you know, an unwilling settler, also on top of being, you know, result of other violences, right?
Margaret.
I just wanted to speak sort of to that same point about being a settler in an area. I am white, so I have not experienced this type of oppression, but something that I spend a lot of time studying in my major has to do with intersectionality. And so you learn to support Indigenous people who are asking for justice, but you don't want to make the narrative about yourself. That's something that we talked about in our breakout room, is about focusing on stepping back, staying out of the spotlight, but making sure that you are able to amplify Indigenous voices, give them the support that they need, whilst not standing in the spotlight and saying, this is about me, 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 because the reality of the situation is it's not about you as a white person, you, the royal you.
Thank you for that, Margaret. Are there any more questions for our speakers? We have some time for some more comments. If there's nothing coming in, I might pose a question. Oh, I see Karen Tailrot raised her hand. Go ahead,
I don't have
Karen.
a blue hand, sorry. Yeah, our group, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm wondering, our group was wondering whether there are any institutions that have actually rematriated any lands or started paying, like you suggested, a land tax or a rent to the people. Do you know of any institutions that have actually started doing that? And if so, what does it look like?
We don't know of any institutions of higher education who have done it, but we're playing with that idea at Virginia Tech. And one way that we're doing that is through this kind of extension arm of what it means to be a land grant. So this kind of mandate that As land grants, it's our obligation to bring the university to the people. And so we happen to be in a particular moment in time at this university where our faculty presented to the board of directors and said, you know, well, we have some real radical ideas about what we want to do with the extension program at Tech and the resources we want to start funneling from Blacksburg throughout the Commonwealth to Indigenous peoples directly. And, you know, we were ready to have a big discussion about how that wasn't going to work well. And they said, this is great. Where's the plan? Write the plan and let's get it moving. So there are ways that we can creatively think about that. That's one way. Another way is that you can do this with your associations as academics. You know, we go to conferences and our conferences want to give land acknowledgement statements. One of the things that I did this past year with some friends, because sociologists think it's, you know, real chic now to give a land acknowledgement statement. And we said, this is fantastic, you can do this. However, if you're going to give a land acknowledgement statement, you must also pay a land tax, or else don't bother giving this statement at all. And of course, this kind of rattled a lot of people, but in one of our major sociology associations, we were able to pass a resolution this year so that every time our conference moves around what is the US to a different city, we are obligated to pay a minimum $500 land tax to Indigenous peoples of that area. And this was a huge concern for a lot of people who said, well, when you're not on the committee, you know, you all who have passed this resolution, how are we going to find Indigenous peoples to pay a tax to? And we said, well, this is part of it. This is much more than the money. This is about building sustainable relationships. This is about having really hard, tough conversations about where you are and whose land you're on, and then going to find communities and going and kind of offering yourself and saying, we intend to visit this place and we want to make sure we're doing this in a good way. And we have this kind of one outlet, just as one of many. How can we begin to be in conversation to do right by your lands as we kind of move freely with our resources and our professors around the country? And I think we're still the only national association who has done this. And there's another set of 2 regional sociology associations who are doing the same thing, because sometimes people don't want to be left behind. They don't want to seem like the only people who can't be woke enough to pay a land tax. And they're like, I never thought of that. So figuring out ways that you can use the resources that you have now while you know, there's a lot of us who are trying to figure out how we rematriate. That doesn't mean we can't do it until we get that exact process. It means we can be real creative with the resources we have right now.
Thank you.
I wanted to share 30 seconds. UCLA in 2017, they had a repatriation back to my community. And UCLA is virtually, has almost repatriated all ancestral remains. I think there's one more case that's lingering. But my community is non-federally recognized from the LA area, doesn't have a land base. And so the question was posed to the chancellor, you know, once we repatriate these, we want to re-enter them into our home territory. Where do we do that? And the chancellor did give an easement to us for repatriation. And so that is one example of, I guess you could say, rematriation. You know, the property is still owned by the university and the University of California, but the easement ensures to us that our ancestors will never be disturbed again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers for encouraging us to think about creative ways to think about land back and rematriation. I'm so happy that question got asked. I know we're running over time, but I promised Dominique I would ask one question, and it's quick, which is do you both have a research paper we can access if we're interested in learning more about your research on this subject? And then I'll turn it over to my colleague for closing remarks.
The project that Theresa and I are working on, we're working on it. We're finishing up analysis, and we hope to have a final paper by the end of the year. You know, where it gets published and how long that takes, we couldn't say, but we will have something. And then in March 2021, I have a paper coming out with Kei Wen Yang. and that's entitled Beyond Land Acknowledgements in Settler Universities. And it talks about a lot of what I presented on with regard to land acknowledgements. If you email me, I'll share it with you. I share it with people on occasion, or we have been sharing it with people, so.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Okay, so I think, is Alex here?
I'm here.
Yay! I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, Dr. Mejia, for some closing remarks.
Yes. So first of all, I want to thank the speakers for their presentation. For me, I was telling the people in my group, it was an eye opener of the realities of land-grant institutions. I myself attended a land-grant institution. I benefited from that education, and for my PhD. And we never talked about it. We never had these conversations. I really quickly just Googled whether the university actually had a land acknowledgement, and they still don't have one, right? So it's definitely an eye opener for me. And I did not know this about the university. I did not know that it had been able to maintain this endowment and that it continues to be that they continue to be beneficiaries of Indigenous dispossession. So I thank you for your talk, and definitely as an alumni, I'm gonna ask my university, to do something about it. I think that's the important part of land acknowledgement, that we need to make them into actual actions. So land acknowledgement should be an honest and historically accurate way to recognize the traditional territories of place, to commemorate the reciprocal exchange with the land, the kinship to the land, right? And through that land acknowledgement, I think that it is also important for us to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as the stewards of the land. But at the same time, for us as, being part of, the colonizing machine, right? And being also beneficiaries of all of this, we need to think about what we are acknowledging, right? When we say we acknowledge the land, are we just acknowledging the land, or are we actually acknowledging the presence of these communities, their knowledge? Do we see these communities as holders and creators of knowledge, or do we just say it for lip service, right? I come from a field, engineering, where we really don't talk about Indigenous communities or Indigenous people at all. In my field of engineering, we rarely talk about how Indigenous people were the first scientists or the first engineers or the first mathematicians. And so we forget that by not acknowledging the land, we're also disregarding their presence, we're disregarding their contributions, right? And instead of contributing to, their own activism, right? The things that, the ways in which we should honor them, we instead participate in a narrative of erasure, right? We erase their ways of knowing, their ways of doing, their ways of being, and we fail to acknowledge the material realities of their everyday lives. And so when we acknowledge the land, I think that, I guess as a closing remark, we also need to reflect on what we are acknowledging. We should see it as a call to action. It is a call to all of us about the responsibility that we have in making that acknowledgement a reality, but also acknowledging it not just at that one point in time, but at all times, right? It is important to understand our long-standing history, with that has brought us to reside on this land. And we need to think about how we understand our place in this space and the history behind it as well. So thank you for your wisdom. I really appreciate it. And with that, I don't know if Percy's still around.
I'm here.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Mejia. Thank you to everybody for all of your comments, and especially thank you to the students and the USD community members who showed up and had really great conversations. It was really nice to be able to have that exchange with everyone. So we will keep an eye out for some research papers and continuing thoughts and findings, and just maybe we can do a part 2 at some point. So thank you everybody for coming. Have a wonderful night. Enjoy what's left of Indigenous Peoples Day. Take care.
Thank you.